The atmosphere in the opulent banquet hall was heavy with the aroma of wealth and orchids, an overwhelming fragrance of achievement. Countless members of Chicago's upper crust floated across the polished stone floor, their chuckles resembling the tinkling of wine flutes, empty and sparkling. For Sophia Grant, however, the space had narrowed to one intense focal point. Her former husband, Victor Lang, positioned himself in front of her, a malicious grin curling his mouth. Next to him, grasping his arm, was Victoria, the lady who had supplanted her. "You can't halt us," Victoria murmured, her tone a poisonous confidential remark. Victor chuckled, a profound booming noise that resonated with victory. Yet on the opposite side of the chamber, another individual, the reserved and influential Alexander Voss, wasn't observing them. He was fixated on Sophia, and he noticed her grin. The Grand Heritage Ball was a combat zone masked as a celebration. The armaments were myriad grins and biting murmurs. The protection was designer attire, and success was gauged by who occupied the most elite group of dialogue. Sophia Grant had previously dominated this landscape with natural poise. This evening she was an outsider in her previous existence. She clutched her flute of sparkling wine like a barrier, the chilled glass a minor stabilizer amid an ocean of predators. She had anticipated their presence. Victor Lang would never skip a chance to flaunt his accomplishments. And his latest prize, Victoria Duval, was a vital element of that display. Encountering them resembled viewing a vehicle collision in gradual motion. Terrifying but inescapable to avert one's gaze. Victor, in his custom-fitted formal wear and effortless allure, appeared every inch the business mogul she had assisted in forging. Victoria was a spectacle in scarlet satin. Her freshness and contrived devotion, a harsh, agonizing opposition to the serene collaboration Sophia and Victor had formerly enjoyed. Their advance was intentional, a predator encircling its quarry for amusement. The assembly divided for them, their mutterings lingering like the hem of Victoria's dress. "Sophia," Victor started, his speech infused with a condescending affection that caused her flesh to prickle. "I'm astonished to encounter you here. I assumed you'd still be acclimating." Acclimating. That was his term for dismantling the existence they had constructed jointly. For stowing her possessions into cartons while Victoria's were relocated in, for the stark conclusiveness of a separation document that resembled more an expulsion order. "I'm fully acclimated, Victor." "Appreciate it," she responded, her speech steady, revealing none of the quiver she sensed in her fingers. She encountered Victoria's stare. The younger lady's gaze was vivid with a territorial blaze. This was her instant, the communal enthronement. "I truly admire what you've accomplished with the loft," Victoria remarked, her manner oozing with phony kindness. "The sparse style is so pristine. It's as if the location has no past whatsoever." It was a precise strike, and they both recognized it. Each artwork, each volume, each thoughtfully selected furnishing that had narrated the tale of Sophia's existence with Victor had been erased. Sophia offered a minor, indifferent lift of her shoulders. "Everyone has their preferences. I always believed that past is what endows a place with its essence." Victor's grin expanded. He was relishing this, the communal exhibition of her displacement. He positioned a possessive palm on Victoria's hip, drawing her nearer. It was at that moment that Victoria inclined forward, her scent aggressive and intrusive. "He's escorting me to next week," she whispered, her speech a scheming sibilance intended solely for Sophia. "The directors just endorsed his fresh remuneration plan." "We're commemorating," she halted, permitting the phrases to penetrate before administering the ultimate strike. "You can't halt us." The phrases lingered in the atmosphere, keen and shimmering like a fragment of crystal. It was an assertion of complete conquest. And then Victor chuckled. It wasn't a snicker. It was a profound, visceral chuckle of pure, undiluted victory. It was the noise of a gentleman who thought he had secured everything and forfeited nothing worthwhile. The noise rebounded from the elevated ornate ceilings, attracting looks from adjacent attendees who swiftly averted their eyes, detecting the crude personal brutality of the occasion. The disgrace was a tangible pressure bearing down on her, robbing the breath from her chest. For one alarming instant, Sophia experienced the burn of tears. She felt the impulse to smash her flute, to yell, to reveal the repulsive reality of the gentleman beneath the refined exterior, but she refrained. Instead, something different assumed control. An odd, icy serenity flowed through her bloodstream. She recalled the extended evenings devoted to examining Victor's corporate schemes, the concessions she'd made for his aspirations, the wisdom he had extracted and then abandoned. He had overlooked her identity. He perceived a spouse he had discarded like an outdated garment. He had no notion he had relinquished his most precious resource. And thus Sophia Grant grinned. It wasn't a broad, frenzied beam, nor was it a tormented scowl. It was a modest, hushed, insightful grin that didn't fully extend to her eyes, but contained a cosmos of purpose inside it. It was the grin of a strategy expert who perceives the playing field several steps in advance. It was a grin that conveyed, "You have no clue what you've just initiated." The chuckle expired in Victor's larynx, his forehead creased in bewilderment. Victoria's victorious demeanor wavered. Her statement was intended to shatter her, but Sophia's grin was a defense it could not breach. It was a reply to an inquiry they hadn't realized to pose. Across the expansive chamber, positioned near the balcony doors that opened to the veranda, Alexander Voss observed the whole interaction. He was a gentleman who operated in obscurity. His aura a subdued gravity in any setting. His dominion was constructed on perceiving what others overlooked, the delicate indicators, the alterations in authority, the concealed flaws. He had been monitoring Victor Lang for months, but his curiosity had lately transitioned. He witnessed Victor's harsh chuckle and Victoria's conceited declaration. But what captured his focus, what genuinely enthralled him, was the former wife. He observed her endure the communal assault, noticed the glimmer of agony she believed no one could perceive, and then beheld the remarkable metamorphosis. He saw her grin. And unlike Victor, Alexander Voss comprehended precisely what that grin signified. It wasn't a concession of loss. It was the commencement of a conflict. The conclusion didn't arrive like an abrupt detonation. It was a gradual contamination, a progressive deterioration of confidence and closeness that Sophia had neglected to identify until the signs were lethal. Victor hadn't always been a villain. The gentleman she'd wedded 15 years prior was driven and captivating, but he also harbored a fragility that had made her feel indispensable. He had visions of establishing a monetary dominion. And she, with her acute analytical intellect and expertise in market tactics, was not merely his companion in life but the unspoken designer of his elevation. Their initial years were a vortex of mutual objective. They resided in a compact stair-access flat, their meal table concealed beneath fiscal summaries and proposal outlines. Sophia had abandoned a hopeful profession at a premier advisory company to aid him initiate Lang Ventures. It wasn't a forfeiture to her. It was an allocation in their union. She was the one who pinpointed the undervalued software startup that became their inaugural significant triumph. She was the one who fashioned the thorough demonstrations that persuaded their original doubtful financiers. Victor was the visage, the persuasive vendor. She was the mechanism concealed in the engine compartment, guaranteeing it all functioned flawlessly. "We're a duo, Soph," he used to utter, pressing his lips to her brow as they labored deep into the darkness. "You're my hidden advantage." The toxins started to infiltrate with prosperity. The we gradually transformed into I. It was no longer our initial major victory, but the agreement I finalized. When reporters composed profiles on the rapid ascent of Lang Ventures, her name was never referenced. Initially, she convinced herself it was irrelevant. The prosperity was authentic and she was an element of it. But then arrived the understated rejections. "Don't trouble your lovely mind about the periodic statements," he'd declare, even though she could recite them verbatim. "You've merited a break. Go acquire something." He commenced to reshape her narrative. Her tactical genius was redefined as mere encouragement. Her choice to depart her employment became a tale he narrated about how he desired to sustain her so she wouldn't need to labor. He was segregating her from her own accomplishments stone by stone until she was positioned in a splendid ornate confinement of his creation. The manipulation was subtle. When she'd contest him on a corporate choice, highlighting a defect in his reasoning, he would charge her with being pessimistic or worse, of not relying on him. "Sophia, I'm the one in the fray daily," he'd contend, his speech tolerant as if clarifying something to a youngster. "The competition has evolved since you were involved. It's more intense now. You wouldn't grasp it." She began to question herself. Had she forfeited her sharpness? Was he correct? The assured, astute lady who had once directed conference rooms now discovered herself reconsidering every intuition. He made her feel insignificant, and the tinier she felt, the larger he appeared. Victoria's emergence was simply the ultimate foreseeable deed. Sophia uncovered the liaison not via a makeup-marked shirt, but through the impersonal, detached information of a payment record. Resort accommodations in locales where Victor had no conferences, adornments from shops he'd never escort her to, an abrupt and lavish record of her existence he was experiencing without her. The clash was barren and professional. He didn't refute it. He handled it like an adversarial merger of their union. "It's simply time for an alteration, Sophia," he stated, seated opposite her in their austere pale lounge, the urban illuminations sparkling coldly behind him. Individuals like enterprises sometimes need to divest from suboptimal resources. The savagery of the analogy was astonishing. She was a suboptimal resource. 15 years of her existence, her affection, her wisdom diminished to an entry on a ledger he was keen to eliminate. "All those years, Victor," she uttered, her speech vacant. "The evenings we devoted to constructing this. Does any of that signify anything to you?" "It was a distinct period," he answered without a trace of regret. "I'm thankful for your preliminary inputs, naturally, and you will be adequately remunerated for your duration." He was presenting her a termination bundle. He had already conferred with his attorneys. The separation was a commercial exchange, and he had arranged the arrangement wholly in his benefit. Utilizing prenuptial pacts she'd endorsed in a fog of affection and faith decades earlier. He was departing her with sufficient funds to be at ease, but not enough to be influential. He was assuring she could never pose a danger. In the concluding days, as she stowed her existence into cartons, she discovered an age journal from the early period. It was brimming with her script, market evaluations, investment approaches, concepts she had outlined that had become the very supports of Lang Ventures. On one sheet, she had elaborated a high-hazard, high-benefit merger tactic for a specialized AI enterprise. At the summit of the sheet, Victor had inscribed, "Too hazardous, sophomore. Let's adhere to what we comprehend." She recollected the dispute. He had rejected the concept as imprudent. A year subsequently, that identical AI enterprise was merged by a competitor firm for 10 times its original worth. A maneuver that generated headlines in the Financial Times. Victor had never referenced it again. Gazing at her own foresight evaluation, a frigid wrath started to supplant her sorrow. He hadn't merely betrayed her as a spouse, he had dismissed her as a tactician. He had appropriated her genius, employed it to erect his realm, and then barred her when she was no longer suitable. His paramount flaw was his vanity. He sincerely thought he had accomplished it all independently. He had forgotten that his hidden advantage had an intellect of its own. Stowing the final carton, she secured it with adhesive. She was not merely securing away recollections of a deceased union. She was packing away her sorrow, her uncertainty, her anguish. She was abandoning the remnants, and from them a scheme was commencing to emerge. A scheme constructed not on sentiment, but on stark, unyielding facts. The very dialect he had instructed her, and then foolishly presumed she had overlooked. He believed he had triumphed. He hadn't yet comprehended the contest had just initiated. Alexander Voss's workspace was a mute attestation to authority. Situated on the uppermost level of a tower that penetrated the core of Chicago, its wall-to-ceiling panes provided a divine perspective of the metropolis. There was no disarray, no individual snapshots, only a substantial commanding desk of glossed onyx and a solitary magnificent carving in the nook. Voss himself was much akin to his workspace, austere, exact, and emanating an aura of inaccessible dominance. He didn't erect his multi-billion-dollar dominion, Voss Enterprises, with allure. He erected it with rationale, endurance, and an almost ethereal capacity to detect an adversary's fracture point. When Sophia Grant had solicited a conference 3 weeks prior to the ball, his interest was aroused. He knew her only by designation. The reserved, graceful spouse of Victor Lang, a gentleman Alexander regarded as a heedless show-off, all spectacle and no base. He had consented to the conference out of a mild scholarly curiosity. He allocated her 15 minutes. She entered not as a casualty pursuing assistance, but as an equal offering a suggestion. She was attired in a crisp, subtle professional ensemble, her bearing serene and expert. There were no sobs, no appeals for compassion. She bore a solitary slender leather dossier. "Mr. Voss," she commenced, her speech firm as she occupied the seat he proffered. "Thank you for your duration. I understand you and my imminent former spouse are rivals in the mergers arena. I think I possess something that might captivate you." Alexander stayed mute, his interlocked digits resting below his jaw, his gaze disclosing nothing. He was an expert in employing silence to compel others to converse, to cause them to over-elaborate and expose their vulnerabilities. Sophia didn't waver. She unveiled her dossier and slid a solitary leaf of paper across the extensive desk. It wasn't a supplication. It was outline. On it was a comprehensive multi-stage tactic entitled Project Collapse. It was a scheme to methodically disassemble Lang Ventures. Victor has constructed his firm on a base of forceful, highly indebted transactions, Sophia clarified, her manner objective, as if debating an example study. He portrays an image of impregnability, but his holdings are perilously overextended, especially in the Asian software domain. He's conceited. He trusts his own publicity. That's his vulnerability. Alexander's gaze dropped to the paper, then returned to her. He was fascinated. Now, this was not the babbling of a rejected lady. This was the frigid, accurate dialect of a superior-level tactician. "And you know this how?" he inquired, his speech a deep bass. "Because I authored the original corporate scheme for Lang Ventures," Sophia declared without arrogance or bitterness. "It was merely a reality. I devised the preliminary investment frameworks. I know where every support is, which means I also know which ones are weight-bearing and which ones are empty." She continued to outline her scheme. It was ingenious in its nuance. It wasn't about a solitary devastating assault. It was about a multitude of incisions. It entailed recruiting vital personnel Victor had become complacent about, utilizing regulatory gaps in his international assets. She knew he disregarded and foreseeing his next major merger objective and arriving there first. Not necessarily to purchase it, but to inflate the cost and compel him to overcompensate, further straining his assets. Alexander attended, his countenance inscrutable. He had compensated his own group's millions to discover a susceptibility in Lang's dominion, and they had uncovered nothing this penetrating, this personal. Sophia wasn't just providing him a corporate scheme. She was delivering him a mental diagram of his competitor. "Why approach me?" he eventually inquired. "This is a scheme for retribution. It's individual." "Of course it's individual," Sophia conceded, her expert facade fracturing for just an instant to disclose a spark of resolve. "He attempted to obliterate me. He appropriated 15 years of my existence and my labor and informed me it was valueless. I'm not aiming to ruin him for sentimental fulfillment, Mr. Voss. I'm aiming for a market adjustment. He is inflated and I plan to demonstrate it. I possess the intellectual resources, but I lack the monetary means to implement this on a large scale. You possess the means, and what do you obtain from it? I don't desire your funds," she stated resolutely. "I desire support. I desire to launch my own consulting enterprise. You can be my inaugural silent patron. When Lang Ventures' primary assets are depreciated and prepared for merger, your firm will be in the foremost position to incorporate them for a portion of their present value. My compensation will be my own triumph constructed on the debris of the firm that abandoned me." It was the boldness of the proposal that confirmed it. She wasn't requesting charity. She was presenting him a prospect, a collaboration. She had militarized her anguish and converted it into a painstakingly designed scheme for gain and equity. He rose and proceeded to the pane, gazing down at the metropolis below. He viewed the world as an intricate array of mechanisms and controls. This lady comprehended the controls. "There is a ball in 3 weeks," he stated, pivoting back to her. "At the Institute, Lang will be there with his new companion. He will attempt to disgrace you. He will require to affirm his own choice. That will be your trial. If you can confront him in that chamber and not fracture, our coalition commences the following dawn." Sophia rose, her poise total. "I won't fracture, Mr. Voss." "I know," he stated, a glimmer of something that might have been admiration in his shadowy eyes. "He thinks he's in a triumph procession. He doesn't comprehend he's advancing into a trap." The ball, therefore, was not the start of her disgrace, but the ultimate phase in her enlistment. Her grin, the one that had so perplexed Victor and Victoria, was an indicator to the gentleman observing from across the chamber. It was a communication that conveyed, the trial is concluded. The coalition is established. Let the contest commence. The morning following the ball, the metropolis was enveloped in a cool silver haze, an appropriate setting for the hushed conflict Sophia was about to initiate. She didn't feel intoxicated from wine, but from excitement. The recollection of Victor's bewildered countenance and Victoria's stumbling haughtiness was a powerful mixture, more exhilarating than any beverage. Her fresh commencement wasn't in a shining skyscraper, but in a humble, refined workspace she had rented in an unassuming structure in the Loop district. It was hers. The designation on the etched glass entrance was straightforward. Grant Consulting Firm. There was no pomp, no declaration in the business media. The most potent assaults are the ones the adversary never anticipates. Alexander Voss was faithful to his pledge. An electronic transfer of initial funds labeled as an advisory fee had materialized in her new enterprise account before the financial institutions even formally commenced. It wasn't an amount substantial enough to attract notice, but it was sufficient. Sufficient to employ a modest superior group and procure the finest information analysis programs available. Her initial objective was not a firm, but an individual, Ethan Hale. Ethan was the director of hazard evaluation at Lang Ventures, a reserved prodigy with an almost lyrical comprehension of market fluctuations. He was also persistently undervalued. Sophia knew that Victor compensated him generously, but handled him like an elevated accountant, frequently openly rejecting his prudent alerts as gloomy fretting. Ethan was faithful, but his faithfulness was to the soundness of the figures, not to the gentleman who disregarded them. He was, in Sophia's judgment, a support that appeared firm, but was prepared to collapse. She didn't dispatch a recruiter. She contacted him personally. "Ethan, it's Sophia Grant." There was an astonished hush on the opposite end of the connection. "Sophia, goodness, I'm regretful about everything." "Don't be," she stated, her speech cordial but straightforward. "I'm contacting with an offer, not for sympathies. I've initiated my own enterprise. Grant Consulting. I'm seeking a collaborator, not a staff member. Someone who prizes anticipation over audacity. Someone who isn't hesitant to inform a patron they're about to plunge into an abyss." She allowed the suggestion to suspend in the atmosphere. She knew Ethan had debated vehemently against Victor's recent enormous allocation in a Japanese automation company, a firm whose liability to capital proportion was, in Ethan's own phrases, a fragile structure in a typhoon. She heard him exhale. Victor wouldn't heed. "I will," Sophia stated plainly. "Meet me for a beverage, my workspace, 1 hour." Ethan Hale entered Grant Consulting Firm 58 minutes later. By the conclusion of the day, he had submitted his departure at Lang Ventures. Victor's response was precisely as Sophia had foreseen, fury succeeded by indifference. He contacted her, his speech strained with anger. "What in the world do you think you're accomplishing, Sophia, recruiting my leading evaluator? Is this some pitiful little vengeance plot?" "It's commerce, Victor," she answered serenely, envisioning him striding his extensive workspace, his visage reddened. "Ethan was searching for a fresh prospect, and I supplied one. You should be pleased for him." "Pleased for him?" "He endorsed a confidentiality pact. He can't take anything with him." "I'm not concerned with your outdated information, Victor," she stated, the falsehood savoring delightful. Ethan's comprehensive awareness of Lang Ventures' susceptibilities was her genuine reward. "I'm concerned with his intellect, something you evidently underestimated." She disconnected before he could reply, a shiver of gratification coursing through her. The initial incision had been executed. It was minor, but it was profound, and it was directed at Victor's conceit. The second maneuver was even more nuanced. Sophia knew Victor was vigorously pursuing a profitable patron, the retirement reserve of her enormous traditional wealth production conglomerate. Victor's presentation was all about elevated returns, forceful expansion. He was vowing them the stars. Sophia didn't attempt to pilfer the patron. Instead, she utilized her new enterprise to release a thoroughly investigated nameless report on the concealed dangers in the Asian software domain, particularly the volatility of over-indebted automation firms. She didn't designate Lang Ventures or the Japanese company, but for anyone who knew where to search, the communication was evident. She had the report quietly distributed among retirement reserve administrators and fiscal evaluators, including the very ones the conglomerate had on its directors. The report provoked a slight commotion in the business community, a wave of prudence. 2 weeks subsequently, reports emerged that the conglomerate had resolved against transferring their retirement reserve to Lang Ventures, referencing a wish for a more traditional, risk-averse tactic. Victor wouldn't be able to link it back to her directly, but he would experience the pain of the defeat. He would be enraged, perplexed. He was a predator that functioned on impulse and hostility. He wouldn't grasp this type of mental combat. He was battling a phantom. Seated in her hushed workspace, observing the urban lights commence to sparkle as twilight descended, Sophia felt a feeling of direction she hadn't encountered in years. This wasn't just about retribution anymore. It was about reclaiming the portion of herself she had permitted to be interred. Victor thought she was engaging in games. He still perceived her as his sentimental former spouse, striking out in anguish. He couldn't fathom that she wasn't engaging in his game at all. She was engaging in her own, and she was just commencing. The initial few months of Sophia's initiative were examination in accuracy. Victor felt the consequences not as an immediate attack but as a sequence of inexplicable adversities. A crucial patron forfeited a hopeful agreement that deteriorated at the final moment. The disturbing exit of not just Ethan Hale but 2 other emerging evaluators who trailed him to Grant Consulting. Victor viewed these as separate occurrences, unfortunate interruptions in an otherwise impeccable profession. His vanity wouldn't permit him to link the elements to even imagine that Sophia could be the designer of his difficulties. But the strain started to accumulate and it pursued a discharge mechanism. That mechanism was his connection with Victoria. Their existence together, which had begun as a storm of secret resort gatherings and lavish presents, was supposed to be the reward. For Victoria, Victor symbolized an escape from existence of ordinariness. He was her access into a realm of events, private aircraft, and repercussion-free opulence. She hadn't enrolled for a conflict. She had enrolled for a triumph circuit. The Fishers first materialized over supper at a prestigious eatery where the cuisine was artwork and the invoice was a home loan installment. I viewed images of Sophia's new workspace, Victoria stated, browsing through her device, a slight scowl spoiling her flawless traits. It's so tiny. It's almost tragic. It's a farce. Victor grumbled, twirling the wine in his goblet. He had just expended the afternoon in a strained conference with his directors, clarifying why the retirement reserve agreement had imploded. She's pretending to be an entrepreneur to annoy me. It'll collapse in 6 months. Still, Victoria urged, Ethan Hale labors for her now. Individuals are discussing. They're saying he abandoned a failing vessel. Victor's gaze shot up from his wine, his amiable disposition evaporating. What vessel is failing? Lang Ventures just had its second most lucrative period in history. Who is individuals? Just murmurs, Victoria stated, retreating slightly from his abrupt fervor. At the spa, at midday meal, they ponder why your leading evaluator would depart for her. He was an elevated accountant, Victor falsified, his speech keen, easily substituted. This discussion is tedious. But the murmurs pursued him. The business world was a small intertwined network. The story was shifting. Victor Lang, the impregnable giant, was abruptly appearing vulnerable. The halo of impregnability he had so meticulously nurtured was starting to dull. The tension made him unstable. He became abrupt, fixated on labor, and increasingly suspicious. He would expend late evenings in his residence workspace scrutinizing reports, attempting to discover a concrete foe to combat, but all he discovered were phantoms. Victoria, who had envisioned an existence of relaxed morning meals and affectionate escapes, found herself cohabiting with a preoccupied, irritable gentleman who handled her less like a companion and more like an ornamental item of decor. Her requests for focus, once satisfied with lenient grins and costly adornments, were now satisfied with irritation. The fracture point arrived one evening in their barren, sparse loft. Victoria entered flushed with enthusiasm, clutching a Voyage periodical. "Beloved, I was considering," she started, draping herself over the rear of his seat. "We never took that journey to Cannes. What about next month? We could remain at the resort, dear." "I don't have duration for Cannes," Victor barked, not glancing up from his computer. "We're in the midst of a significant pursuit for a dominating share in Nexus Tech. It's a sensitive discussion." But you vowed, she stated, her speech turning whiny. You said we would commemorate. We'll commemorate when I finalize the cursed agreement, he bellowed, slamming his computer closed. He rose, his tall stature looming over her. The effortless allure was absent, replaced by a crude, repulsive frustration. Do you have any notion the sort of strain I'm under? Do you think this dominion operates itself while you're out expending my funds on exorbitant footwear? I'm in combat. Victoria withdrew, her gaze filling with tears of astonishment and outrage. Expending your funds? I relinquished my whole existence for you. I supported you while you managed that resentful harpy of a former spouse. A harpy who, for all her defects, at least comprehended what it required to construct this firm. The phrases were out of his mouth before he could halt them. It was a lethal error, and they both recognized it. He had summoned the specter. He had admitted in an instant of fury that Sophia possessed a worth that Victoria did not. The hush in the chamber was overwhelming. Victoria's countenance was a veil of frigid wrath. The delusion of their ideal romance, of her absolute conquest over Sophia, had been fragmented. She wasn't his companion. She was his diversion. And now that he was no longer diverted, she was becoming a nuisance. Don't you ever, she whispered, her speech quivering with wrath, compare me to her again. She pivoted and stormed out of the chamber. Victor stood solitary, the resonance of his own phrases deriding him. He had secured Victoria, but he was losing his hold. The fissures in his ideal exterior were expanding, and he had the submerging sensation that the whole structure was erected on terrain far less steady than he had ever envisioned. The conflict he was combating wasn't just in the executive suite anymore. It had trailed him residence. The Nexus Tech merger was intended to be Victor's magnum opus. It was a daring, forceful maneuver to incorporate a smaller but highly creative competitor in the supply chain innovation space. Finalizing the agreement would not only be tremendously gainful, it would be a demonstration of strength. A conclusive declaration to the marketplace that Lang Ventures was more robust than ever and that the recent murmurs of its decline were baseless. Victor invested all his vigor and a hazardous quantity of fluid capital into the endeavor, resolute to make it his victorious endgame. He viewed it as the conclusion of the contest. For Sophia, it was the opportunity she had been awaiting. From the instant she'd heard whispers of Victor's curiosity in Nexus Tech, she had activated her own scheme. Ethan Hale, with his personal awareness of Victor's hazard endurance, verified her doubts. He'll overextend, Ethan had stated, indicating a series of diagrams in their serene workspace. He's sentimentally committed in this. He requires a communal victory, so he'll be willing to overcompensate. His vanity is steering the discussion, not his judgment. Sophia didn't attempt to surpass his offer. That was a crude power tactic, and her methods were precise. Instead, she and her modest group at Grant Consulting initiated a profound investigation into Nexus Tech, searching for the one thing Victor, in his rush, would have neglected. They expended weeks scrutinizing patent submissions, global transport records, and scientific publications. The revelation was interred in a thick, terminology-laden patent supplement from an affiliate of Nexus Tech based in Tokyo. It was an essential program element for their primary supply chain system, an element they didn't possess but permitted. The patent was retained by a small obscure innovation enterprise in Tokyo, a firm so negligible it scarcely registered on any fiscal evaluator's monitoring. More crucially, the permission pact had an alteration of authority provision. If Nexus Tech was merged, the new overseeing firm would have to renegotiate the permission conditions from the beginning. This was the pivot. This was Victor's oversight. Sophia traveled to Tokyo. She didn't go as a rival. She went as a prospective collaborator. She conferred with the originators of the small Japanese enterprise, a duo of ingenious but financially constrained developers. She didn't discuss Victor Lang or Nexus Tech. Instead, she outlined a vision for their innovation, displaying them uses and markets they had never contemplated. She presented them a tomorrow. Then she executed her maneuver using a proxy corporation financed by Alexander Voss's silent funds. Grant Consulting acquired a dominating stake in the small Tokyo firm. The exchange was so insignificant it didn't generate news. It was a stone dropped into the sea, but it was about to generate a deluge. Back in Chicago, Victor was in the concluding phases of the Nexus Tech agreement. He had intimidated the directors, vowed the heavens, and consented to a price that made his own consultants perspire. The agreements were prepared. The media announcement declaring the merger was already composed. The day prior to the agreement was scheduled to finalize, Nexus Tech's directors received a correspondence. It was from a legal enterprise representing the small, previously unfamiliar innovation firm in Tokyo. The correspondence courteously notified them that upon the merger by Lang Ventures, the permission for their core program element would be revoked. It further declared that the new proprietors of the patent were not interested in re-permitting the innovation to any entity linked with Lang Ventures. They were, however, receptive to exclusive collaborations with other sector frontrunners. The impact was immediate and disastrous. Without the permission, Nexus Tech's core offering was worthless. The entire assessment of the firm crumbled. The agreement was doomed. When the report reached Victor, he was in a directors' conference presenting the ultimate figures. His device vibrated and he glanced at the communication from his legal group. The hue drained from his visage. He stared at the display, his mind incapable to process the phrases. It was inconceivable. A firm he had never even heard of had just thwarted a billion-dollar agreement. Within hours, the narrative leaked to the business media. Lang Ventures' Nexus Tech merger implodes over vital patent conflict. The repercussions was severe. Lang Ventures' equity, which had been exaggerated by the pledge of the agreement, dropped by 30% in a single day. Billions in market worth vanished. The directors, which had once venerated Victor, was now regarding him with unconcealed wrath. They requested an urgent conference. They desired to know how their celebrated leader had overlooked something so basic. How had he led them and their financiers into disaster? Victor secured himself in his workspace, the horizon of Chicago deriding him through the sweeping panes. He was trembling with a wrath so deep it felt like a bodily ailment. This wasn't misfortune. This wasn't a coincidence. The accuracy of the assault was too impeccable. The timing too ruinous. He finally knew with assurance that chilled him to the core who was responsible. It wasn't a competitor enterprise. It was the phantom. It was the reserved, underestimated lady he had rejected as a suboptimal resource. Sophia had done more than just cost him an agreement. She had utilized his own conceit as a weapon against him. She had demonstrated to his directors, his financiers, and the whole world that he was not an invincible giant. He was just a gentleman, a heedless and defective gentleman who had been outsmarted by the one individual he never even considered a participant in the contest. The authority disparity had not just shifted, it had been entirely reversed. Despair is an erosive substance. For Victor Lang, it corroded the remaining traces of his refined allure, leaving behind the crude, snarling vanity of a trapped beast. The Nexus Tech catastrophe had initiated a waterfall of failures. Creditors were demanding repayments, financiers were withdrawing, and his directors was openly debating his dismissal. The dominion he had erected was disintegrating around him, and he knew with nauseating clarity who wielded the demolition tool. He appeared at Sophia's workspace without notice. He didn't trouble with the assistant, merely shoving past her and marching down the brief corridor to the etched glass entrance of Sophia's private workspace. He flung it open without rapping. Sophia was positioned at her pane, gazing out at the metropolis. She didn't appear astonished to see him. She pivoted gradually, her countenance serene, her poise a stark opposition to his unkempt appearance. His neckwear was loosened, his locks were disarrayed, and his gaze was frantic with a blend of wrath and dread. This was not the assured, chuckling gentleman from the ball. This was a gentleman on the brink of destruction. You, he exhaled, his speech a jagged murmur. This was all you. Greetings, Victor, she stated, her speech balanced. You're intruding. Don't engage in games with me, Sophia, he yelled, taking a stride into the chamber. The Japanese patent, the retirement reserve, hail, all of it. You've been methodically attempting to ruin me. I haven't been attempting to do anything, Victor, she answered, her serenity aggravating him further. I've been achieving. There's a distinction. He stared at her, momentarily voiceless. The lady standing before him was not the spouse he had abandoned. She was keener, more imposing, radiating a hushed fortitude he had never witnessed before because he had never bothered to observe. His anger abruptly subsided, replaced by a desperate, scheming ploy. He mellowed his countenance, his speech dropping to the personal tone he had once employed to captivate her. Soph, attend to me, he stated, taking another stride nearer. I know you're furious. You have every entitlement to be. I was an idiot. I was haughty and I injured you. I am so regretful. He was attempting to reverse time to locate the sentimental controls that had once functioned on her. He was playing the remorse strategy, the ultimate sanctuary of an exposed fraud. I miss what we possessed, he persisted, his speech dense with false sentiment. The early period, the two of us against the globe. We were a duo. We can be again. Cease this, Sophia. Please. We can depart from this, you and I. We can recommence. He was presenting her an agreement just as he had presented her a termination bundle. He still perceived her as something to be handled, an issue to be resolved with the appropriate combination of phrases. Sophia attended to his pitiful appeal, and she felt nothing. The anguish he had inflicted on her was a remote mark, no longer an exposed injury. The affection she once had for him was a section in a volume she had long since completed perusing. This instant wasn't about wrath or retribution. It was about resolution. It was her salvation. No, Victor, she stated, her speech gentle, but indestructible. We were never a duo. I was your tactician, your evaluator, and your companion. And you were the gentleman who appropriated all the acclaim and then informed me I was a suboptimal resource. You didn't just terminate our union. You attempted to erase my whole contribution to your existence, to my own existence. She proceeded from the pane and stood directly in front of him, compelling him to meet her gaze. This isn't about us recommencing, she persisted. This is about a market adjustment. You erected a dominion on a falsehood. The falsehood that you did it independently. I'm just demonstrating the world the truth. The base was always fractured, and you were too haughty to perceive it. His countenance solidified again as he comprehended his scheming had failed. The crude self-obsessed reappeared. You'll be left with nothing. The remnants of my firm won't be sufficient to construct your pitiful little enterprise. A hushed rap sounded on the open entrance. Both Sophia and Victor pivoted. Alexander Voss stood there, his aura filling the doorway. He didn't regard Victor. His gaze was fastened on Sophia, a mute inquiry in his eyes. Sophia gave him a modest, reassuring inclination. Alexander's aura was not a salvation. It was a declaration. He was not just her supporter. He was her collaborator. Theirs was a coalition constructed not on feeling or history, but on a base of mutual admiration and shared tactic. He had perceived her genius from the start. I think you should depart now, Victor, Sophia stated, her speech regaining its conclusiveness. The accounting was concluded. Victor looked from Sophia's steadfast countenance to Alexander's frigid, inscrutable countenance. He perceived the hushed, impenetrable coalition between them. He was utterly, completely vanquished. There were no more maneuvers to execute. He had been thwarted from every perspective. Without another phrase, he pivoted and departed, a reduced figure withdrawing from the arena of conflict he had so haughtily initiated. Sophia observed him go, then pivoted to Alexander. "It's completed," she stated. "I know," he answered, his speech low. He stepped into the chamber, his eyes scanning her countenance, not for vulnerability, but for affirmation of her fortitude. "Are you all right?" "I am," Sophia stated, and the veracity of it settled deep in her essence. "For the first time in a very long time, I really am." The conflict was concluded. Now it was time to construct. A year later, the perspective from Sophia's workspace was different. Grant consulting firm now occupied the entire 40th level of a sleek contemporary structure in River North. The sparse aesthetic wasn't barren like Victor's old loft. It was deliberate, filled with clean contours, warm timbers, and vibrant conceptual art. It was a space that fostered clarity and concentration. It was a space she had constructed. Her enterprise had become one of the most desired tactical advisories in the metropolis. Her renown was built on her almost prophetic ability to identify concealed dangers and prospects, the very abilities Victor had rejected. She didn't command chambers with loudness, but with the quiet, undeniable gravity of her wisdom. She was admired, and more importantly, she admired herself. The business news feed on the screen in her workspace lobby narrated the ultimate section of Victor Lang's tale. Lang Ventures, hampered by debt and a crisis of assurance, had been fragmented and its sustainable assets disposed. Voss Enterprises had merged the majority for a fraction of the cost, a maneuver praised by the media as a masterstroke of opportunity. Victor himself was absent from the communal view, compelled into a reserved, shameful withdrawal. He was an annotation in the annals of the dominion he thought he'd constructed. Victoria Duval had disappeared even quicker, her online profiles erased, her presence in the elite society sections replaced by the next driven young lady. Their grandus had proven to be as empty as their vows. Sophia felt no victory in their downfall, only a hushed sense of finality, of equilibrium restored. Her concentration was no longer on the past, but on the future she was actively forging. The entrance to her workspace opened, and Alexander Voss entered. Their connection had developed beyond the preliminary calculated coalition. It had intensified into a collaboration that was both expert and personal, though it resisted simple classifications. It was constructed on the uncommon delight of two intellects that advanced at the same velocity, that perceived the world with the same tactical clarity. There was an effortless ease between them, an abbreviation in their silences. He didn't utter, simply delivered her a device. On the display was a news notification. Grant Consulting had just been designated the primary tactical collaborator for an enormous new sustainable power reserve, an agreement that would not only be incredibly gainful, but would also have a tangible beneficial influence. It was the type of labor Sophia had always envisioned doing, constructing something significant, something that endured. She glanced up at him, an authentic, luminous grin illuminating her countenance. It was nothing like the calculated, mysterious grin she had worn at the ball. This one was genuine, earned, and completely her own. "Excellent labor, Sophia," he stated, his own lips curving into an uncommon modest grin. "Excellent labor, Alexander," she amended softly. "We did it." He proceeded to the vast pane, gazing out at the expansive metropolis below. Sophia came and stood beside him. The perspective was boundless, a panorama of crystal and metal shimmering under the afternoon radiance. A year ago, this metropolis had felt like an enclosure, a place of communal disgrace and private sorrow. Now it felt like a realm of possibilities. She was not defined by the gentleman who had attempted to shatter her, nor by the one who had assisted her ascend. She was defined by her own tenacity, her own wisdom, her own unrelenting refusal to be obliterated. She had confronted the communal disdain of a former spouse, and his paramour endured the chuckle and responded to their challenge not with phrases but with a hushed, devastating triumph that had reshaped her world. She had in the end halted them, and in doing so she had finally truly commenced her own existence. From the remnants of a disgracing confrontation, Sophia Grant didn't just ascend, she reconstructed a dominion in her own likeness. Her tale is a potent reminder that the most silent individual in the chamber is often the most perilous. And true authority isn't about who chuckles the loudest, but who has the last, most meaningful grin. It's a voyage from being an underestimated resource to an unstoppable force, proving that the best retribution is not just living well, but strategically disassembling the world of those who wronged you. If Sophia's remarkable tale of tenacity and salvation inspired you, demonstrate your support by pressing that approval button. Distribute this video with someone who needs to perceive that it's never too late to reclaim your authority. And enroll for more indelible tales of equity. What would you have done in her position?